Dear Clara, you are a figment of our imaginations. Me and my daughter Nora, your great-grandmother. I set out the parameters, she filled in the gaps. You are a girl, she said. You're 21 years old. No, 9. Well, she hasn't fully decided yet. You have a best friend, her name is Lila. Your name is Clara. When I asked why, she shrugged. The most memorable piece of advice I have received in these last 2 years studying at an art academy is, it doesn't all have to make so much sense. Every fiber in my body rebels at this. I want there to be a reason for my decisions. I want them to be logical. This is a leftover from my photojournalistic upbringing. The problem with this kind of thinking is that it all becomes about the final product, the ultimate image. When you're constantly striving to create something sublime, it stops you from experimenting. I end up not creating anything that I don't already know how to do. I attended a talk with British photographer Paul Graham once. He said, "The only faith worse than death is having to repeat myself over and over again for the rest of my life." I concur. I have started to let go. I have started to accept the laws of control. I have started to set myself new challenges. Challenges that can't be solved by heading out on the road with a camera. How do you photograph the past? How do you create images showing imagined moments from stories told by others? How do you photograph the future? Maybe you don't. Maybe you paint it instead. Maybe you speculate and invite people to speculate with you. Maybe you care less about the ultimate image, the end goal, and focus on the process instead. Maybe you find that your life and your practice slowly starts to merge as you find the questions you're asking yourself professionally are the same questions you should be asking yourself privately, and vice versa. I have brought play back into my life. When Nora and I built a refugee camp in our back garden, when we started to paint postcards to send to the future, when we told your story to each other, or when we decided to build a radio out of electrical wire, a razor blade and graphite from a pencil. While exploring this good life, there was always a little stern voice in the back of my head asking, "But why?" Then, little by little, the most amazing thing started to happen. Slowly, ideas, explorations and experiments started to align. They started to come together, to intertwine with each other and point towards new realizations. As I began to quieten that stern voice in the back of my head and stop trying to make everything to make sense, it began to do just that. I think I'm finally managing to just shrug. It makes sense now, Clara. This project is our gift to you. It is a part of my legacy as a photographer and a great-great-grandfather. It is also my gift to Nora and Nora's gift to me. Our time spent exploring, building, creating and being together. Our lives entwined, telling stories, shrugging our shoulders, heading out to play. Dear Clara, how do borders look like in your Europe, in your future? Here in the 21st century, perhaps we Europeans have taken them for granted, but they rise and fall all the time, in big and little ways. They have shaped us, they shape you. Here are some of the stories, Clara, and some photos. There are all different kinds of things here. Photos from across Europe now, stories and images from archives about our shared and divided history. Images I've made to show you our time. Images about wars, refugees, travelers and those who tell their grandparents' stories, fraught crossings and joyful meetings. Other images created to explore the miracle of the everyday, the wonders of life that transcend science and the explainable. The little things that bind us together across nations. I'm still collecting, still talking to people across Europe, asking them to tell their stories. This project will never really be done, Clara, my daughter's daughter's daughter. This is about the lines that divide and connect us. For you. Crossing borders. I remember the first time I brought Nora home for Christmas, from London to Denmark. It was 2015. She was 2 years old and we were traveling alone. The news that summer had been dominated by one thing: the high number of migrants crossing into Europe over the border from Turkey and arriving on boats to islands like Lampedusa and Lesbos. Newspapers wrote about the refugee crisis, and images of large groups of men, women, children walking on the motorway and sleeping at train stations started to spread through the media. Words like invading, hordes, and defend started to appear, while politicians talked about the hidden terrorist threat, and the German Chancellor Angela Merkel said, "Wir schaffen das." We can do it, as 1 million refugees arrived in Germany. A statement that will forever be part of her legacy. I followed the Danish news from London. There were daily reports from the most recent locations of the refugees as they continued their journey up through Germany and slowly made their way towards the Danish border. Red arrows printed on maps showed the influx of the others, and for the first time in my living memory, Danish and European borders were being shut instead of opened up further. Some of the more visible cracks in the ever-expanding European project started to show as countries turned inwards, and the idea of the strong national state spread across the political spectrum, from right to left. As the first groups of refugees crossed over the Danish border, Sweden introduced border controls on all arrivals from Denmark. For me, Sweden has always been an extension of my own nationality. One of the most vivid memories from my childhood is one of my cousin and I traveling from our hometown of Elsinore, the home of Hamlet and Ophelia and their castle, is what I normally tell people, across Öresund to Helsingborg in Sweden. We would jump on the little ferries, Sundbusserne, the buses of the strait dividing the two countries as they were known. They had names like Pernille or Jakob. We were little, maybe 6 or 7. And we would travel with my grandmother, who would buy Gevalia coffee and packs of duty-free cigarettes for her boyfriend Kjell. It would take 20 minutes to sail the 2 kilometers from one country to the other. And the only reason it would take that long was that you needed to eat a hot dog and drink a Kokyo chocolate milk. Or a strong bottle of beer if you were one of those customers that would stay on the boat and just sail back and forth without stepping ashore until evening time when it was time to go home. My cousin and I would be the first one on and the first ones off the boat. Our grandmother far behind, but no one would ask us for tickets getting on, and no one would ever dream of asking us for our passports or reasons for traveling to Sweden when jumping off. A lot has happened since the 80s. As Nora and I landed in Copenhagen, I prepared our passports and could feel a certain anxiety rising. Back then, she traveled on her Irish passport, just like her mum. This was 4 more years until I obtained Danish citizenship for her. We also don't share the same last name. She's good like her mum, while I am Schøring like my dad. The only thing that links us is our shared middle name, Bjur. That and the papers from Hackney Town Hall stating that I'm her father. A signed letter as required from her mum giving me permission to travel with our daughter within the month of December 2015. And then the thousands of images on my phone of me and her together. Our collective memories. Me holding her for the first time in the delivery room at the hospital, just moments after she was born. A wrinkly little baby still covered in bits of placenta and blood from the umbilical cord I had just cut. As I write this, I look up at my cork bulletin board above my desk and see this image hanging right in front of me, carried by a yellow pin that has been stuck there for years now. Us celebrating birthdays together, going for walks along the canal together, her in her green stroller, me in my magic green Carhartt zip-up sweatshirt, her falling asleep on my chest. I thought that if they wanted proof that she is my daughter, maybe the images will show them that it is true, even though her mother is not with us. Her mother wouldn't be expected to carry a letter from me, allowing my daughter to travel. As the queue shortened and we approached passport control, I made sure to have all the papers and documents ready in one hand while carrying Nora on my arm. My anxiety was rising. My head started to pound extra hard while I practiced my story again and again in my head. Years later, and even to this day, when I'm going through customs with Nora, I still feel the same worry, the same anxiety creeping up. For a long time I would tell her over and over again that she had to reply to them if they asked her any questions, and that she had to reply to them in Danish at the Danish border and in English at the UK border. She was shy and didn't want to talk to strangers. I felt like a criminal when she would look down and I would laugh in a fake-sounding apologetic way while beginning to explain on her behalf. In the cold Copenhagen airport, The glass cubicle rose up in front of us. The officer took our passports, ignoring all the extra documents. She scanned them quickly with her eyes. She looked up and asked, "Anders or Nora?" "Yes," I replied. "Welcome home," she replied with a big, warm smile. As I type this, I can feel the emotions welling up inside me and tears taking shape in my eyes. Never have I felt so embraced and loved by my country before. As we finally settled down in the coastal rail train that travels all the way from Sweden past the airport and to Elsinore, I started to feel at home. This train line has always been part of my life, carrying me first from Elsinore to Copenhagen with my parents when we traveled to the capital. The 40-minute journey seemed like an eternity. To when I was a teenager making the journey on my own, to see friends get drunk or get stoned. Slowly, I have made the journey back less and less often, moving my life away from one home and family and towards a new home and new friends. The new, albeit temporary, family you acquire in your youth. This time, Nora sat next to me, cuddling into my arms, and started her own journey. I looked up and over to the next booth beside us. I could see a family of 4, a mother and a father and 2 little kids. Boys, one the same age as Nora, the other slightly older. They were unusually quiet and almost didn't move. I realized then that they were refugees. The mum was sitting quietly and looking out the window with her head resting on the window frame. Maybe she was sleeping. The father, a man in his 30s, like me, staring straight ahead. Alert, worried. The most unusual thing about the whole situation was the 2 kids, each still in their warm coats. As Nora happily blabbered away, playing with her teddy, looking through a book, the boys on the other side of the aisle sat absolutely still, hands in their laps, looking straight ahead, no expression showing in their little faces. Like little statues, or actually, like little human beings who know that being seen is the greatest danger and therefore are afraid of being visible. As I studied the family, the father turned his head and we locked eyes. I smiled at him and he smiled back with his mouth. His eyes were far away. We acknowledged each other, tired fathers traveling, carrying the responsibility of our children and the well-being of our families. The shared feeling of being responsible for someone else's entire future. This is where the similarities ended. Me, free to cross almost every single international border with no or very little effort, and taking this for granted, doing so multiple times a year. Them having traveled for weeks or months from outside the EU, through a hostile Europe, while living in hiding and smuggling themselves over borders in the middle of the night. Us, heading to our family home full of food, running water and warm beds. Them, stuck on a train, not able to travel 30 minutes one way as they'll be stopped at the Swedish border, and not being able to travel more than an hour in the other direction, as that is the end of the line. There was nothing beyond that point. No beds, no food, and no safety. There was no one there to welcome them home. As the ticket officer made his way through the train, they slowly started to get up. They had a one-way ticket to Sweden, and it was no longer valid as they were denied entry. And now they were traveling backwards. The ticket controller held back the train until they all got off. As the train set in motion, I looked at them through the window while they grew smaller and disappeared, lost in a country that doesn't want them. To this day, I regret not offering them a place to stay. My dad's flat was empty as he was out crossing international borders himself, him and his beetroot-colored passport. Could they have stayed there, at least until after Christmas? To this day, I regret not having exchanged at least just a few words with the father. To this day, I continue living life as if this episode just never happened. Fagus sylvatica papaya, or copper beech, also known as purple beech, is a cultivated form of common beech, although copper-colored beech trees are also sometimes found in nature. It grows to the height of more than 40 meters. The bark is smooth, thin and grey, often with slight horizontal etchings. Twigs are slender and grey but not straight. Their shape resembles a zigzag. Torpedo-shaped leaf buds are coppery and up to 2 centimeters in length, with a distinctive crisscross pattern. The deep red-colored leaves makes the tree easily recognizable in the landscape. The woodland trust on the copper beech. The main route to Denmark from Germany via car takes you along the E45 highway. The first signs of Denmark will be the Scandinavian Park to your left, a big shopping complex specializing in selling beer, liquor, cigarettes and candy for Danes crossing the border to save money on the lower German tax. Shortly thereafter, you will see the white plastic pavilions rising in the distance on both sides of the motorway. Here, the Danish National Guard will ask to see your passport, or just wave you through if you have the correct combination of numbers and letters on your number plate, showing you are arriving home to the motherland instead of visiting from afar. Just before the border, unnoticeable to the naked eye, you will have passed the southernmost point of mainland Denmark. Just 50 meters from a German highway named Elon Øst. This V-shaped line draws itself on paper maps and digital digits entered into computer systems. There's no stone marking this spot, neither a fence nor a wall showing that you are either at the end or at the beginning of a country. If you want to get to this point, you either have to walk across a field belonging to a German farm, or across the border into Denmark, take the first right, then a second, leave your car, pass a farmhouse and then cross another field, this time Danish. Until at the end you will find yourself placed at what Google Maps categorizes as a tourist attraction. It is only with the help of Google Maps or some other precise GPS measuring tool that you will be able to tell that you are there. At this spot, where surveyors and politicians after a referendum in 1920 decided to draw the line. In 1864, in the Second Schleswig War, Denmark lost the duchies of Slesvig, Holstein and Lauenburg to Prussia after a painful defeat at the Battle of Dybbøl Mølle, a mill that still stands to this day. But it wasn't just land that was lost. It was also a sense of Danish self-worth. This one defeat has caused deep wounds in the collective soul of the nation and is, alongside our Viking heritage, a major part of how Danes now define themselves. Songs have been written about the battle, museums built, books written, paintings painted and memorials erected. As the Danish-Prussian War ended in 1864, the areas of Slesvig and Holstein were captured by Germany and an organized Germanification took place. Soon it became illegal to teach Danish in the now German schools. Danish institutions were closed down and Danish culture was suppressed by the new authorities. Due to this, Danish nationalism started to grow in the region, and another thing that started to grow was the Ficus sylvatica papaya, the copper beech tree. Due to its deep red leaves, it was grown in the backyards and gardens of the many homesteads still loyal to Denmark, as a secret sign to other Danes that here lived one of them. Although they might be strangers, although they might have never met, they knew they would know the same words to the same songs, have told the same nursery rhymes as kids, and loved the same tree for the color of its leaves, red as the Danish flag. It has become part of the nation's collective memory, the myth of the lost battle, the bombarded mill, the missing land. At the end of the First World War, as part of the peace treaty, it was decided that there should be a referendum in the former Duchy of Schleswig, an area that was largely captured by Prussia in the 1864 war. The referendum would let the people in the region decide where they felt like they belonged. Were they Danish or were they German? On the 10th of February 1920, one half decided to become Danish while the other voted for German. A new border had to be drawn. Civil servants on both sides of the border started to look at the maps. The new border had to run about 50 kilometers south of the current one. What was there that couldn't be divided? Farmhouses from the fields, for example. Villages and towns had to belong to one or the other. There was no question about that. In some places, smaller roads were running east to west, good places to draw a line. At the most eastern point, where land meets the sea, there was the fjord of Flensborg, or Flensburg, depending on what side you voted for. Here, Kroså, or Krosau, which was just too small to be a river, but big enough to be a border, twisted its currents through the countryside. Another good place to draw a line. Slowly and methodically, the officials worked their way from one end to the other. In Tønder, one of the biggest cities in the area, the majority voted for Germany, but still ended up Danish as it was surrounded by Danish-friendly areas. An island of Germany in the middle of Denmark was unthinkable, especially a wealthy one. Other times, the border was drawn just north or just south of small farms, depending on what nationality the families there felt like they belonged to. Just south of the main Danish border town of Padborg, the owner of the farm, Simondis, insisted that he, his family and the farm should belong to Denmark. And in the end, the surveyors took a hard left, drew down, right and then back up. They were now Danish. In this sharply drawn half square, there is one thing that breaks the line of the ruler. In the eastern corner of the square is a little nook, where it seems like there ought to be a hard angle. The line suddenly veers off, goes out a bit, just 10 meters, and it becomes round, almost soft, like something that hasn't been calculated and therefore shouldn't exist. On this spot in 1920, and many years before that, stood an old wilted tree. The farmer, the civil servants, and thereby the two countries decided that this was a Danish tree, not German, and therefore another little dent was added to the otherwise strict line. Nowadays, the old tree is long gone, but the border remains. Dear Clara, do you know the story about the blind men and the elephant? It is an old Indian tale about a group of blind men who encounter an elephant, and each of them only being able to partially grasp the magnificent creature by touching just one part of it, is never able to understand the totality of the beast. This is how I feel about the topics I'm trying to approach in this project. When I first started photographing this body of work many years ago, I wanted to see if I could find a European identity. I was fumbling and feeling along actual land borders throughout the continent, not becoming much wiser. How do you define European identity? Well, don't ask me. As I traveled, the project kept twisting and turning, slowly spiraling out of control. It is not possible to capture the multitudes of reflections in a human soul in a single image, nor in 1,000 images. Imagine trying to capture the essence of 750 million souls. No, it will never happen. I also realized that so much of this identity was anchored in history, things that had come to pass long ago. Some big events that are explored in history books, but mostly small, personal narratives playing out in family lore going back generations. A broken heart, a new love, a death in the family, or a global pandemic. Like the beat of a butterfly's wing, these small events could ripple out down through generations and be decisive for the life of, for example, a great-great-granddaughter just like you. I realized that my old toolbox wasn't up to the job anymore, and I needed to expand it in order to find ways of allowing room for these stories. New technologies were needed and old rules had to be broken. Although I have explored and reinvented many things with this work, I am no closer to the answer as to whether there is such a thing as a European identity. I've stopped looking for the answer, Clara, and started to just ask the questions. I really believe that if we all start asking ourselves more questions about who we are, we'll collectively move towards an answer. The story about the two grandfathers and the border between, or the influence of imagery and memory on our collective identity. The image. A man stands looking, hat under arm, uniform, around him a garden, trees in bloom. It must be spring. The image is black and white. The fabric of the cloth it is placed upon is green. The past here in the present. A man I feel like I've never known, although he is in no way unknown to me. This picture of a picture contains multitudes. I have known iterations of him. The one who taught me to play chess in his upstairs workshop. The one who would sit in his big armchair smoking his pipe in the quiet living room. The sweet-smelling smoke would hang in the air. The only sound would be the floor clock ticking away. There was the one standing at my grandmother's hospital bed after she had closed her eyes for what would be the last time, urging me to talk to her, to see if the sound of my voice would wake her from her coma. The one who would open up the door to me in the house they had shared after my grandmother's passing. Me, an awkward 14-year-old, not knowing how to react, insisting on shaking hands instead of giving him a hug. Sent there to help him carry out his recycling, although he was in good health and fit for his age. Leaving as soon as I could, carrying the sack of old newspapers. Only now, as I'm writing this, do I realize that the actual task was to give him some company. For him not to sit there alone in the little house with the apple tree in the back garden. I must have failed at that. He died a few years after my grandmother, not wanting to be alone without her, as the family said. A noble way of dying, we said. One that fits the legend that has become my grandfather. The memory. The image, I believe, was taken in 1939, just beyond the 80 years that constitutes the average longevity of communicative memory. My grandfather himself never told me about his time as a soldier in the war. I was too young when he passed to ask him about it. Remember that shy teenager. And he wasn't someone who would share his stories without being prompted to do so. The narrative that I know comes from my great aunt, my grandfather's sister, whom I spent a lot of time with growing up. She would tell the story about how after the Danish capitulation to Hitler in 1940, and my grandfather was stationed along the Danish-German border, he would jump on his motorbike, drive to the estate that my grandmother was working at as a chambermaid, and thereon to Copenhagen, where they started their life together. Or the story about how during the war, when he was part of the resistance, he would hide weapons underneath the apples from their garden in wooden crates that were stored in their basement. Or was it home-printed leaflets he was hiding from the Germans? And that motorbike, was it just a push bike? My great aunt died in 2015, and with her, my last living memory to that time disappeared. No one really remembers the stories anymore, and I am aware of how I have an urge to retell them in ways in which I would like to believe they happened. Our communicative memory is slowly dispersing, transforming into the final stages before completely evaporating. Now it lives as a memory of someone else's memory of a story told. I come from a family of war. We all do, if we look back far enough. My great-grandfather on my paternal side, so from the other side, which you will see in more ways than one in just a moment, was a drummer boy in the German army during the First Schleswig War between Denmark and Germany, which Germany lost in 1852. As the German troops were defeated, my great-grandfather decided to desert the army, cross the border and start a life in Denmark. With 100 years difference, two of my grandfathers were fighting on opposite sides of the same border, each defending, more or less willingly, values that were meant to be unique to their country. Values that were meant to show them who they were and maybe more importantly, who they were not. I don't remember my great-grandfather for good reasons. He died many, many years before I was born. I know that he was born in 1826 in Hanover, and I know that there are no images existing of him that I am aware of. I also know that he built a life as a German refugee in Denmark, while the German army won the most defining battle in Danish history, the Second Schleswig War in 1864. A defeat that not only moved the Danish border many, many kilometers north, but also dealt a blow to the Danish national psyche, a blow that is still felt to this day. A picture of a picture. The picture presented at the beginning of this chapter is not a picture of my grandfather. It is a picture of my grandfather. The original picture belonged to my great aunt and was shown to me on one of my many visits to a house in the countryside on the island of Fyn. First, I went for holidays there with my mother. Later, I went alone to visit or to stay for longer periods as a young man. Nete, my great aunt, lived until she was 93 years old and survived her brothers and sisters by more than 20 years. So when I started to be interested in our family history, she was the only one left to retell the stories. She had become the family poet, the holder of history, a specialized carrier of memory, as Asman puts it. The original picture is black and white, printed on paper, a glossy surface, fragile, old. The white paper on the back of the image is yellowed with age, and in a thin, fine line is written, "Bjur in uniform." The photographer, as well as the exact time of exposure and type of camera, is unknown. The picture we are looking at here is digital, created only by data, and it is one-dimensional. All information regarding shutter speed, color, space, megabit, and exact time and place can be read from the metadata. I took it with my mobile phone, and I remember the moments, sitting there with my great aunts at the end of the dining table, in the living room, with the fire burning in the stove. Or was it summer? Was the fire burning? My own memories are so fragile and mutable. When I look at this image, I can feel the texture of the green tablecloth. I see this soft yellow light coming from the iconic Danish pH lamp. I remember the way she would sit at the table, her glasses, the wrinkles in her face. The first car she had, that I remember, was red. Her second and last car, I didn't like it that much, was silver, and I would drive it to our trip to the butcher to pick up the special salami. She would make homemade strawberry ice cream for me when I came to stay for the summer holidays as a child. I remember the first time she met Nora. I remember the last time I said goodbye to her, just days before her passing. How she sat in the new chair that we had bought for her to give her a bit of extra support in her last days. Her body frail, her cheeks sunken. One of the last things she said to me was, "Please make sure that Nora won't forget me." These are my memories. They belong to me. Every time I have a chance to tell my daughter about Nete, I ask Nora if she remembers her. At first she would say no, and I would tell her more stories. Stories about memories I had with Nete. Stories that Nete told me, and stories about memories that I would have about Nora and Nete together. Now when I ask, she mostly says yes, and we will tell those stories together, to each other, to remember. My memories have become hers. The picture that we are looking at here holds many layers, many stories, and many memories. The image we are looking at here transcends time and holds many purposes. Mirrored in memory, this image contains multitudes. Although it is somewhat a stranger that stands in front of me in this image, I also recognize him in more ways than one. I recognize his features, his stoicism. I see my brother in him. I see myself. I also see a young man about to embark on his adult life. When I saw the original image for the first time 8 to 9 years ago, although older than him in that moment, I recognize that feeling of embarking on your life. I recognize myself and the unknown of the journey I was and am undertaking. As Susan Sontag so eloquently writes, the photograph of the missing being will touch me like the delayed rays of a star. A sort of umbilical cord links the body of the photographed thing to my gaze. Light, though impalpable, is here a carnal medium, a skin I share with anyone who has been photographed. Through this image, I can reach out and touch my past, my present, and our collective future.